Welcome to one of the most disturbing and quietly scandalous cases buried in the annals of Southern history. A story that forces us to question everything we think we know about lineage, inheritance, and the lengths to which people will go to preserve a name. Tell us where you're watching from, and what time you are watching. What follows is not a tale of open rebellion or public scandal. It is a story of deception so carefully constructed, so artfully woven into the fabric of a community's identity, that it endured unchallenged for more than 80 years. It began, as many Southern stories did, with a death and with the pressure that followed it. In the summer of 1853, the death of Thomas L., a wealthy plantation owner and prominent figure in Savannah society, sent ripples through the city's tightly wound social order. His name was etched into the ledgers of shipping companies and slave auctions, his initials carved into the facade of the local courthouse. He left behind thousands of acres of fertile land, dozens of enslaved laborers, and a mansion that served as both his family home and a stage for the rituals of the antebellum elite. What he did not leave behind was an heir. 2 sons had died in infancy. A daughter had succumbed to fever at 6. The family line and the fortune that accompanied it teetered on the edge of extinction. For his widow Eleanor, barely 35 and already draped in a heavy black silk of mourning, that fact represented not only personal grief but existential threat. In a world where a woman's social standing was tethered to the men around her, widowhood was a precarious state. Without a male heir, Eleanor faced a future defined by diminishing control. Trustees appointed by distant male relatives, legal oversight of her property, and the slow erosion of her influence in a society that viewed childless widows with suspicion. But Eleanor L. was not a woman inclined to surrender. Known for her quiet intelligence and unyielding poise, she had managed her husband's affairs during his frequent absences and maintained a network of confidants among Savannah's most influential families. Even so, no one could have predicted the course she would take, or the lie that would come to define her family's legacy. The first hint of that lie did not emerge until more than a year after Thomas's funeral. On an unremarkable morning in late autumn of 1854, a short notice appeared in the Savannah Daily Republican. Mrs. Eleanor L. joyfully announces the birth of the son, James, posthumous issue of the late Mr. Thomas L. The announcement was met with polite congratulations and whispered confusion. No one recalled seeing Eleanor pregnant. No one could say who attended the birth. The obituary of Thomas had stated clearly that he died in July 1853, 16 months earlier, and yet there was in black ink, a male heir miraculously born to secure the lineage and inherit the estate. Society, bound by etiquette and self-interest, did not press the issue. A widow's virtue was not to be publicly questioned, and a wealthy family's continuity was not to be scrutinized too closely. The matter, it seemed, was settled, but beneath the veneer of polite acceptance, rumors festered. Parish records show that when the infant James was baptized at St. John's Episcopal Church, the entry included an unusual notation. Presented by the widow herself, no witnesses. Midwives and household staff who had once served the L. family disappeared from Savannah's directories. A young enslaved woman named Sarah, known among the servants for her intelligence and quiet dignity, was abruptly sold to a distant plantation, though no sale record survives. Neighbors recalled seeing shutters drawn over the east wing of the mansion for months on end, even during the sweltering August heat. Some swore they heard the cries of an infant long before the public announcement. Others noticed milk deliveries to the house despite no children being present. These fragments, scattered and seemingly inconsequential, would take nearly a century to coalesce into a coherent and devastating truth. In the decade that followed, James L. grew into a respected figure in Savannah society. He inherited his father's lands, expanded the family's wealth through railroad investments, and endowed schools and hospitals that bore his name. Portraits of him hung in the courthouse and the university library. To all appearances, he was an embodiment of Southern aristocracy, dignified, philanthropic, and legitimate. Yet in the shadows of that legacy, a different story persisted. Among the city's black community, whispered recollections told of a woman named Sarah who bore a child in secret. Oral histories passed down through generations spoke of a promise made by a mistress to a servant, that their son would never know the whip or the auction block, that he would inherit a life denied to so many. It was a story without documents, dismissed as folklore by historians who trusted ledgers over memory. And yet it lingered, like a hairline crack beneath the paint of an ancestral portrait, invisible until time widened it. That widening began in 1912, when a routine renovation of the estate uncovered a false drawer in an antique writing desk. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with fraying silk ribbon, their paper yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, and signed only S. They spoke of love and betrayal, of nights spent in fear and hope, of a child hidden in plain sight. They described a plan, Eleanor's plan, to present that child as her late husband's heir. They hinted, too, at threats made and bargains struck, though the details were maddeningly incomplete. These letters did not yet prove anything, but they cracked open a door that had been sealed for generations. From that moment forward, the story of the family would never again sit comfortably in Savannah's official histories. What had once been a tale of resilience and lineage now bore the weight of deception, coercion, and stolen identity. And as archivists, genealogists, and descendants sifted the fragments left behind, the baptismal note with no witnesses, the vanished servant, the hidden letters, a chilling question took shape. Had one of the city's most celebrated bloodlines been built upon a deliberate, calculated lie? The answer to that question, and the trail of evidence that eventually unearthed it, begins with a single, extraordinary choice made by a widow who refused to let her name or her fortune die with her husband. To understand the scale of Eleanor Lavington's deception, we must first understand the world into which it was born, a world that regarded lineage as sacred, blood as destiny, and the racial order as immutable law. Savannah in 1854 was a city balanced on the edge of a knife, its wealth drawn from cotton and human bondage, its identity built upon carefully maintained hierarchies. Cobblestone streets echoed with the creak of carriages and the clang of iron-bound wheels hauling bales of cotton toward the riverfront. Spanish moss draped over oak branches like mourning veils, filtering the relentless Georgian sun into muted, cathedral-like light. At the center of this world stood men like Thomas Lavington, planners, merchants, and legislators whose fortunes were entwined with the institution of slavery and whose names were inscribed into the civic fabric of the city. The Lavington estate lay just beyond the city's northern edge, a sprawling Georgian-style mansion surrounded by more than 2,000 acres of fertile land. Its fields produced a long staple cotton prized by European mills, and its wealth was measured not just in acres or currency, but in the number of enslaved lives it controlled. Thomas Lavington was known as a pragmatic man, stern, methodical, and deeply invested in the stability of his lineage. Like many men of his class, he believed that family name was not merely a matter of inheritance, but form of property itself, to be guarded and perpetuated as fiercely as the land beneath his feet. His death in the summer of 1853, following a sudden fever that swept through the low country, left a void not only in his household, but in the city's tightly woven social web. And in that void, dangerous questions began to stir. For a widow like Eleanor, society's expectations were suffocatingly clear. She was to wear black for a year, speak softly of her late husband, and surrender public life to the periphery. Without a male heir, she was expected to live under the supervision of trustees, men from Thomas's extended family, who would administer the estate on behalf of distant cousins or potential claimants. Inheritance laws of the period, codified under Georgia's 1841 statutes, left little room for female autonomy. Women could hold property, yes, but their right to direct its future was severely constrained. Most widows remarried quickly to secure protection and stability. Eleanor did not. She withdrew from Savannah's social circuit, declined invitations, and shuttered herself within the Lavington mansion, venturing out only for church services and the occasional charitable committee meeting. To outsiders, it appeared as though grief had hollowed her. Yet those who knew Eleanor more closely described something else. They spoke of a woman who read widely, who understood the complexities of trust law and estate management, and who possessed a quiet but formidable will. During Thomas's frequent absences on business, it had been Eleanor who oversaw the estate's accounts and resolved disputes with tenants and overseers. Some whispered that she was more capable than her husband had ever been, and more ambitious. Still, even her closest confidants could not have guessed what plans took shape behind the shuttered windows of the Lavington home in the months after Thomas's death. If the world offered her only two choices, remarriage, or obscurity. Eleanor intended to create a third. The stakes were not merely financial. In the antebellum South, lineage was currency and legitimacy was its mint. Without a male heir, the Lavington name would pass into the hands of distant relatives, or worse, dissolve entirely. The idea that a widow might falsify that lineage, that she might present a child not of her husband's blood as his rightful successor, was unthinkable. Such an act would not only upend property law, but also threaten the social order itself, which rested on the supposed purity of white bloodlines and the absolute subjugation of those born into slavery. To even hint that a person of African descent might inherit a plantation, command white workers, or sit among the city's civic leaders was to challenge the ideological bedrock of Southern society. And yet, this is precisely the boundary Eleanor Lavington was preparing to cross. It is important to note that Eleanor was not acting in a vacuum. Across the South, widows, mistresses, and even clergymen occasionally engage in quiet acts of subversion, freeing enslaved people in secret, disguising paternity, or concealing mixed-race children from hostile laws. These acts rarely made their way into public record. They existed instead in the margins, and signed manumission papers tucked into family Bibles, baptismal registers with unusual annotations, or land deeds transferred under pretense of debts repaid. Eleanor would have known of these whispers. She would have understood that the system, for all its rigidity, contained cracks through which a determined person might slip. Her plan, however, was far bolder than most. It did not involve quiet liberation or anonymous benefaction. It involved rewriting the very identity of her family, and doing so in full view of a society that would have destroyed her if it knew the truth. Savannah itself was changing in ways that made her gamble both riskier and more plausible. By the mid-1850s, industrial capital from the north and abroad was flowing into the South's ports and railroads. Merchants and investors cared less about pedigrees and more about profits. Families like the Lavingtons still wielded enormous power, but new fortunes were rising around them, some from shipping, others from banking or manufacturing. Amid this shifting landscape, questions of legitimacy sometimes blurred in pursuit of wealth and stability. A posthumous heir born under unusual circumstances might raise eyebrows, but if he grew into a capable manager, married well, and expanded the family fortune, many would simply choose not to look too closely. Southern society, for all its obsession with bloodlines, had a remarkable capacity for selective blindness when its interests were served. And so, by the time Eleanor emerged from mourning in late 1854 and announced the birth of James Lavington, the city was prepared, perhaps even eager, to accept the story she offered. A widow's grief, a miraculous posthumous child, the continuation of a venerable name. It was a narrative that restored order and spared Savannah the discomfort of a prominent family line dying out. The clergy asked few questions. The courts accepted the baptismal certificate as sufficient proof of legitimacy, and those who doubted did so only in whispers, wary of the social ruin that would follow an accusation so scandalous and impossible to prove. In this environment of polite complicity, Eleanor's deception did not merely survive, it thrived. What Savannah could not see, what no one beyond the walls of the Lavington estate could know, was the cost of that illusion. Somewhere within those walls, an enslaved woman named Sarah had vanished without trace. Somewhere in that house, a child who bore her features and bloodline was being groomed to inherit land, wealth, and power he was never meant to touch. And somewhere in Eleanor's mind, a justification took root, that the lie she was crafting was not a sin, but a salvation for herself, for the name Lavington, and perhaps in a twisted way for the child himself. The stage was set. The roles were cast. All that remained was to erase the past and let the future believe the story she had written. The deception might have endured forever if not for a single, quiet irregularity, one that most would overlook but which, to later investigators, stood out like a loose thread in an otherwise flawless tapestry. It appeared first not in scandalous rumor or courtroom testimony, but in the neat copperplate handwriting of an Episcopal baptismal register from late 1854. James Lavington, it read, son of the late Thomas Lavington and Eleanor Lavington, born October 17, 1854. On its own, the entry was unremarkable, but to anyone who knew the Lavingtons and anyone who read the newspapers, the problem was obvious. Thomas Lavington had died in July 1853, nearly 16 months before the recorded birth. Even accounting for errors in record-keeping, there was no plausible way a child conceived during his lifetime could have been born so late. And yet, there it was, inked into the official parish record as fact. At the time, the inconsistency raised only whispers. Clergy were reluctant to question a woman of Eleanor's standing, and neighbors preferred polite fictions to ugly confrontations. Some speculated that the child had been born prematurely, and that his birth was recorded late for reasons of propriety. Others suggested that Eleanor might have adopted a relative's orphan child to preserve the Lavington line, a socially acceptable, if uncommon, solution. Yet even those explanations failed to account for the peculiar notation appended to the baptismal entry, presented by the widow herself: no witnesses. Such a note was virtually unheard of in Savannah's church records, where baptisms were typically attended by godparents, relatives, or prominent members of the congregation. The absence of any witnesses was not just unusual, it was deeply suspicious. It was not the only anomaly. Delivery logs from a local apothecary show an unusual pattern of purchases in the months preceding James's supposed birth. Laudanum, linen swaddling, and goat's milk ordered weekly and delivered discreetly to the Lavington estate. Wet nurse services were recorded under a false surname, Mrs. Ainsworth, a name associated with no known family in Savannah. When questioned decades later by a parish historian, descendant of the apothecary recalled family stories of a hidden baby at the Lavington house, though none could say precisely when he appeared. And then there was the matter of Sarah. Sarah was an enslaved woman in her early 20s, described in surviving plantation inventories as literate, skilled in sewing, and of calm temperament. She had worked closely with Eleanor, often accompanying her to church and supervising household tasks. In the spring of 1854, just a month before James's birth was announced, Sarah vanished from the records. She does not appear in the estate's slave rolls after May of that year. No bill of sale exists for her transfer, and no death was recorded. She simply ceased to exist on paper. To the white residents of Savannah, this was unremarkable. Enslaved people disappeared from records frequently, sold, gifted, or dead without note. But to future historians piecing together the story, Sarah's disappearance in that precise window was a red flag that could not be ignored. Neighbors recalled details that seemed trivial at the time, but would later assume chilling significance. One visitor to the estate, a Mrs. Lucinda Abernathy, wrote in her 1861 diary of windows shuttered in broad daylight and rooms locked even from trusted servants. Another noted the unusual silence that had settled over the Lavington household in the summer of 1854, broken only by the occasional sound of an infant crying, months before James was supposedly born. A milkman's ledger recorded increased deliveries during that same period, though no reason was given. And in a letter written by Eleanor to her sister Margaret in September 1854, preserved by Margaret's descendants and uncovered in 1929, Eleanor cryptically mentioned a great and private burden I must now bear alone, for the sake of his memory and the honor of our name. Individually, these details could be explained away. Together, they painted a picture of a household carefully hiding something, or someone. The sealed east wing of the mansion, the dismissed servants, the unexplained deliveries, the missing woman, and the baptism without witnesses formed a constellation of irregularities that, while ignored at the time, would later become a foundation of case against the official narrative. Yet even in their own era, they did not go entirely unnoticed. The Reverend Samuel Dorsey, who presided over the baptism, later wrote in his private journal, a document discovered by researchers in the 1970s, that the widow's demeanor was strained, and though she spoke of her son with pride, I could not shake the sense that the Lord's house had been asked to sanctify something concealed. There was also the matter of physical resemblance, a dangerous subject in the antebellum South, where blood and appearance were policed with obsessive scrutiny. According to a reminiscence published in the Savannah Herald in 1889, an elderly housekeeper who had served the Lavingtons in her youth once confided that young Master James had his mother's eyes, but a complexion that was neither hers nor the late master's. Such remarks were dismissed as gossip in their time, yet they would resurface decades later, when genealogists began comparing portraits and written descriptions. One 1868 painting of James at age 14, now housed in the Georgia Historical Society, shows a boy with features that do not clearly reflect the Lavington lineage. Scholars remain divided on how much weight to assign such evidence, but even contemporary observers found themselves quietly unsettled by what they saw. The city, however, had little appetite for scandal. Savannah's elite closed ranks around Eleanor, whether out of genuine belief or self-preservation. To question the legitimacy of James Lavington was to invite a cascade of destabilizing consequences. Challenges to inheritance claims, lawsuits over land titles, and social upheaval in a world built on carefully maintained fictions. So the whispers remained whispers. The parish record was filed without amendment. The newspapers referred to James as Thomas's posthumous son without commentary, and society accepted the story it was given, because the alternative, that a mixed-race child-born enslaved woman might inherit one of the South's great fortunes, was too dangerous even to contemplate aloud. And yet, even as the official version solidified into fact, the inconsistencies refused to disappear entirely. They lingered in margins and footnotes, in private journals and fading letters, in oral traditions passed quietly among the descendants of the enslaved. They were fragments of a truth too explosive for their time, but too persistent to be fully buried. It would take decades and the patient work of historians and genealogists before those fragments began to coalesce into a narrative that challenged everything Savannah believed about the Lavington legacy. But already, in the faint ink of a baptismal register and the silence of a sealed room, the first cracks in the lie had begun to form. If the baptismal record was the first loose thread in the Lavington story, what followed over the next 2 years would unravel the tapestry further. Not through public scandal, but through a series of quiet, unsettling events that hinted at a truth the family could not allow to surface. In the months surrounding the supposed birth of James Lavington, the once bustling estate grew curiously silent. Visitors noted that entire wings of the house, once open for social calls and church gatherings, were sealed without explanation. The east wing shutters were nailed shut despite the brutal summer heat. Chimneys there remained cold, and even trusted servants were barred from entering. Those who approached were told it was under renovation, though no carpenters ever came. What transpired behind those locked doors will remain one of Savannah's most persistent mysteries for decades. The disappearances began quietly. Sarah, the young enslaved woman who had long served as Eleanor's personal attendant, vanished from the Lavington records in May 1854. Her absence was noted nowhere, not in bills of sale, not in burial logs, not even in the family's own plantation ledger, which Thomas had maintained with meticulous detail until his death. Other staff soon followed. 3 domestic servants, all of whom had worked in the main house, were dismissed in rapid succession. A wet nurse hired from a nearby plantation was abruptly released without wages. Even the estate steward, a man who had overseen operations for more than a decade, resigned under circumstances that remain unclear. One later account, recorded in an 1893 oral history by his granddaughter, claimed he saw something he could not abide and left the Lavington service for the sake of his conscience. Rumor spread quietly among Savannah's serving class, the invisible network through which the city's true history often flowed. There were whispers of a woman locked in an upstairs chamber, of a child hidden from view, of arguments overheard between Eleanor and an unknown man. Some claimed Sarah had been sent away to the country, though no one could say where. Others insisted she had died in childbirth and was buried without ceremony in the marshland beyond the cotton fields. None of these stories could be verified, but their persistence spoke to a collective sense that something was deeply amiss within the Lavington household. Those who visited the estate during this period described scenes that seemed ordinary on the surface, but betrayed a deeper tension beneath. In a letter to her sister, Lucinda Abernathy, a frequent guest of Eleanor's, wrote in October 1854 that the house feels hollow, as though its very walls are listening. Eleanor speaks of nothing but the future of her son, yet the child is never brought forth to greet us. At a church tea that same month, Eleanor appeared pale and withdrawn, her usual composure replaced by an edge of brittle defensiveness. When a fellow parishioner offered congratulations on the birth, Eleanor replied curtly, "It is the Lord's that the line continues." It was an odd phrasing, one that several attendees later recalled with unease. The most telling evidence, however, came not from the drawing rooms of Savannah society, but from the hidden corners of the Lavington estate itself. In 1912, during the renovation that uncovered Sarah's letters. Workers also found a small, boarded-over chamber behind a false wall in the east wing. Inside was a cradle, long empty, and a child's wooden rattle carved with the initials jail. The room measured barely 6 feet by 8, with a single narrow window that had been nailed shut from the inside. There were no signs of furniture beyond the cradle and a simple wooden chair. A fireplace, bricked over from the chimney above, suggested the space had once been part of a larger room, perhaps repurposed hastily and secretly. The discovery raised questions historians have debated ever since. Was this where James spent his earliest months, hidden from prying eyes? And if so, was it merely concealment or confinement? One account suggests the secrecy may have extended beyond the walls of the estate. In 1855, a local midwife named Clara Bellamy recorded an unusual entry in her appointment ledger. Summoned to Leaventon property. Entry by side gate. Instructions: speak to no one. No details of the visit survive, and Bellamy herself left Savannah shortly thereafter, relocating to Charleston and never returning. But the notation aligns with the timeline of James's infancy and suggests that whatever transpired within those shuttered rooms required absolute discretion even from those accustomed to secrecy. The disappearance of Sarah remained the most troubling unanswered question of all. No document has ever surfaced to confirm her fate. Yet oral histories collected from black families in Chatham County include repeated references to a Sarah of Leaventon who gave up her son to freedom. One account, recorded in 1934 by a Works Progress Administration interviewer, recounts a story passed down through generations. Miss Sarah had a boy by the master's widow. She cried when he was taken from her, but they said it was so he'd never wear chains. While unverifiable, the story echoes details from Sarah's own surviving letters, which speak a child I cannot hold and a promise that he will live as free as any son in the house. As the months passed, the anomalies compounded. James was presented in public only after his first birthday, an unusually long delay in a society that prized christenings and public introductions. Even then, his appearances were tightly controlled. Portrait sittings were limited, and no daguerreotypes from his infancy have survived, a striking absence given the Leaventons' wealth and social standing. Visitors described a child who was spirited but sheltered, rarely allowed beyond the grounds, and always accompanied by Eleanor herself. When questions arose about his father's death date, Eleanor dismissed them curtly, insisting that Providence has strange timing and that the Lord restores what he takes. The more Eleanor insisted on the legitimacy of her son, the more the inconsistencies around his birth seemed to multiply. But Savannah, unwilling to confront the implications, chose silence over scrutiny. Newspapers continued to refer to James as Thomas's heir. The courts accepted his inheritance claims without objection, and polite society, bound by its own interests and prejudices, allowed the illusion to harden into fact. Yet beneath that veneer of order, the truth was beginning to stir. In vanished names in sealed rooms and in stories whispered in kitchens and fields. The Leaventon legacy was not simply being preserved. It was being rewritten in real time, word by word, omission by omission. This was the dangerous beauty of Eleanor's deception. It did not rely on a single grand falsehood, but on 1,000 small silences. Each missing record, each shuttered room, each servant dismissed without explanation became another brick in the wall that protected the story she was building. And for nearly a century, that wall held. It would take the slow erosion of time and the unearthing of forgotten documents to finally bring its hidden foundation into view. But by then, the lie had already become history. The most damning evidence of Eleanor Leaventon's deception would not come from courtrooms or public testimony, but from fragments of paper hidden in silence for generations, documents that, once uncovered, transformed rumor into plausible truth and speculation into something far more unsettling. They emerged piecemeal, scattered across decades and sources, like shards of shattered mirrors slowly reassembled into an image the city had long refused to see. Taken together, they reveal the outline of conspiracy, intimate, deliberate, and chillingly calculated. The first discovery came in 1912, nearly 60 years after James Leaventon's birth. During renovations of the family estate, workers dismantling an old writing desk found a false drawer containing a bundle of letters wrapped in faded silk ribbon. The paper was brittle and yellowed, the ink brown with age, but the handwriting was still legible, elegant, deliberate, and signed simply S. Historians quickly concluded the author was Sarah, the enslaved woman who had vanished from the Lavington records in 1854. The letters were not addressed to anyone by name, but the tone and references made it clear they were written for Eleanor. Their content shifted from longing to fear, from defiance to resignation, charting a story that official histories had erased. One letter, dated April 1854, read, "He will be born into chains if he is known as mine. But if you promise, truly promise, that he will never know the lash, then I will give him up to the world you belong to. You must swear it. You must make them believe he is yours." Another, undated but likely written weeks later, revealed Sarah's growing despair. "You say he will be safe if he bears your name. But how safe am I? They whisper already. They know I have gone nowhere. If I am sent away, who will tell him the truth?" The last letter, a torn and incomplete page, contained only a few haunting lines. "Do not forget me. Even if you erase me from his story, do not let him forget he was loved." The letters were incendiary, but they were not alone. In 1929, descendants of Eleanor's sister Margaret donated a collection of family papers to the Georgia Historical Society. Among them was a draft of a confession in Eleanor's handwriting, and signed, unsent, and likely never intended to leave her desk. The document, written in 1867, nearly 13 years after James's birth, began as a reflection on her late husband's death, but quickly spiraled into something darker. "I have committed an act that will damn me if known," she wrote. "Yet I cannot repent, for it was done not out of malice, but of duty to Thomas's name, to the land, and perhaps even to the boy himself. He is innocent of his birth. He is innocent of the blood that runs in him. If the world knew, it would destroy him. So I chose a lie." The confession, though never finished, was a revelation. It acknowledged not only the existence of a child whose birth was hidden, but also Eleanor's awareness of the enormity of her deception. It hinted, too, at the societal consequences she feared, the destruction that would follow if the truth were exposed. Some historians argue that the document is proof of intent, a smoking gun that confirms the substitution of Sarah's son as Thomas's heir. Others caution that it is too ambiguous to serve as definitive evidence. Yet even they admit that its tone, paired with Sarah's letters, formed compelling narrative of collusion and concealment. Testimonies recorded decades later added further weight. In 1891, a former Lavington housemaid named Clara Jenkins, by then an elderly woman, gave an interview to a Savannah journalist compiling stories of Old South households. Jenkins, who had been just 14 in 1854, claimed that she once glimpsed Miss Sarah holding a newborn in the sealed East Wing. She was crying, Jenkins recalled. Not loud, but the kind of crying you feel in your chest. Miss Eleanor came in and told me I saw nothing. She said I was mistaken and that I would be sent away if I spoke. The interview was dismissed at the time as unreliable, the faded memory of a woman recalling events nearly 40 years past. But when cross-referenced with the dates in Sarah's letters and the timeline of the baptism, Jenkins's recollection aligned with uncanny precision. Even more revealing were fragments found not in the Lavington archives, but in the records of Savannah's Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction. A deposition taken in 1868 from a man named Josiah Carter, believed to be Sarah's cousin, described a woman named Sarah who bore a child in the house of her mistress and was never seen again. Carter claimed Sarah had confided in him before her disappearance, telling him, "The lady means to raise him as her own, so he will never be sold." While Carter's statement was hearsay and likely of little legal consequence at the time, it added yet another thread connecting Sarah's vanished life, the hidden child, and Eleanor's growing fabrication. Oral histories collected in the 1930s reinforced the written record. Descendants of Sarah's extended family spoke of a boy who lived in the big house under another name. One elderly woman, interviewed in 1937, insisted that her grandmother had always told the story the same way. He was born of Sarah, but he walked in the master's shoes. They said he was the widow's son, but he was not. Everyone knew, but no one dared speak it. These oral accounts, though not admissible as historical proof on their own, provide cultural and genealogical continuity that written records alone cannot supply. They reveal how the story of James's true parentage lived on in the memories of those who were never meant to speak it. What emerges from this mosaic of letters, confessions, depositions, and memories is not a single piece of irrefutable evidence, but a dense web of corroboration. Each fragment on its own might be dismissed as rumor or coincidence. Together, they form a pattern too consistent to ignore. Sarah disappears from the record in the spring of 1854. A child appears months later, inexplicably described as Thomas's posthumous son. Letters speak of a mother giving up her child to secure his freedom. A confession hints at a deception done for the boy's sake. Testimonies describe a hidden infant and a sealed wing. Oral traditions remember a child raised under another name. And through it all runs the unbroken thread of silence. The absence of official records where they should exist, the deliberate omissions that speak louder than any written word. The Lavington family, for its part, never acknowledged these discoveries. The letters remained sealed in the Georgia Historical Society archives for decades, and Eleanor's confession was quietly omitted from family genealogies. James himself lived and died without ever commenting publicly on the rumors that swirled around his birth. Yet the evidence was there, waiting in drawers and diaries and memories, building a case not in the court of law but in the court of history. And in that court, the verdict was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. The heir to one of Savannah's most prominent estates was not the son of Thomas Lavington at all, but an enslaved woman whose name the official records tried to erase. For more than 8 decades, Eleanor Lavington's carefully constructed illusion held. James grew into a man of stature and wealth, his legitimacy rarely questioned in polite company. He married the daughter of a prominent judge, served on the board of a local bank, and became a benefactor to Savannah's cathedral and orphanage. The Lavington name, once threatened with extinction, was etched deeper into the city's history with each passing decade. Yet truth has a way of surviving even the most meticulous efforts to bury it. It lingers in margins, in whispers, an overlooked fragment of evidence that wait patiently to be pieced together. And in 1937, long after Eleanor and James were both dead, those fragments would converge into a revelation that shattered one of the South's most venerated bloodlines. The spark came from an unlikely source, a bitter inheritance dispute among James's grandchildren. The Great Depression had eroded much of the Lavington fortune, and as the estate's remaining assets were divided, competing claims surfaced over property boundaries and trust disbursements. One branch of the family, seeking to discredit another's claim, petitioned the Chatham County Probate Court to order a genealogical verification of the Lavington line, a procedural maneuver meant to resolve questions of legal succession. No one involved expected the test to reveal anything unusual. But science, unlike society, is indifferent to reputation. By the 1930s, advances in serology and blood group typing had become reliable tools in disputed inheritance cases. Court-ordered analyses were conducted on exhumed remains of Thomas Lavington and on preserved tissue samples from James, who had died in 1906. The results were startling. The two men shared no direct paternal lineage. In fact, the markers present in James's remains were inconsistent not only with Thomas's bloodline, but with the extended Lavington male line documented in parish and census records. At first, the discrepancy was attributed to possible contamination, an easy explanation that soothed those desperate to preserve the family's narrative. But repeated testing produced the same result. The conclusion was inescapable. James Lavington was not, and could never have been, the biological son of Thomas Lavington. The revelation ignited a firestorm within the family. Private correspondence from the period, some of which surfaced in later legal filings, shows the descendants scrambling to contain the fallout. One heir wrote to another, "We must suppress this nonsense. The name matters more than the blood." Another, more alarmed, warned, "If this becomes public, our entire claim may unravel." The courts, too, were unprepared for the implications. Georgia's inheritance laws had never contemplated a scenario in which a family's patriarchal line might be disproven decades after fact. Ultimately, the probate judge ruled that James's legal status as Thomas's heir, affirmed by the original estate documents and never challenged in his lifetime, remained valid. The land, titles, and trust would remain with his descendants. But the ruling could not undo what the tests had revealed. the Lavington lineage was not what the world believed it to be. The scientific findings prompted historians and journalists to revisit the scattered pieces of the Lavington story that had long been dismissed as rumor. The baptismal irregularities, Sarah's disappearance, the sealed chamber, the letters and confession, all took on new significance when viewed through the lens of biological evidence. A 1938 article in the Savannah Evening Ledger hinted at the truth with cautious phrasing. Certain discrepancies have arisen regarding the origins of Mr. James Lavington, late of the city, which some scholars suggest may indicate a more complex parentage than previously assumed. The piece was buried on page 6, and names were conspicuously absent, but among Savannah's elite, the message was clear. A story long treated as legend was suddenly, disturbingly plausible. It was not only science that corroborated the truth. Oral histories preserved within black communities around Savannah, once dismissed as folklore, gained new weight. Stories of a woman named Sarah, literate, strong-willed, and disappeared from the Lavington estate after giving birth, align uncannily with the timeline of James's birth. Interviews conducted in the 1930s and 1940s recorded descendants recounting how one of ours was raised in a big house, how his mother gave him up so he'd never be sold, and how they gave him another name. These accounts, once peripheral to the historical record, became essential pieces of the puzzle. They filled in the human dimension that documents alone could not provide. The convergence of scientific data, archival evidence, and oral tradition left historians with little doubt. By the mid-20th century, academic consensus had begun to shift. A 1952 paper in the Georgia Historical Review referred to James Lavington as almost certainly the mixed-race child and enslaved woman known as Sarah, and described Eleanor's deception as one of the most audacious acts of social subversion recorded in the antebellum South. Even cautious scholars admitted that the cumulative evidence was overwhelming. The probability that James Lavington was Thomas's biological son, one genealogist concluded, is effectively zero. The implications of this revelation extended far beyond the Lavington family. It challenged the very foundations of Southern aristocratic myth, the idea that wealth, power, and social standing flowed unbroken through pure bloodlines. It exposed how fragile that myth truly was, how easily it could be manipulated by those with the will and cunning to rewrite it. It also forced historians to reconsider how many other old families might have hidden similar secrets, stories buried beneath respectability, sealed behind shutters, and erased from ledgers but not from memory. The fallout within the Lavington family was profound. Some descendants embraced the truth, arguing that Eleanor's actions, however deceptive, had given a child born into bondage a life of privilege and opportunity. Others reacted with fury, denouncing historians and threatening legal action to block the publication of findings. A few changed their surnames altogether, seeking distance from a legacy now tainted by scandal. Yet the truth, once uncovered, could not be reburied. Even if the law continued to recognize James as Thomas's heir, history had rendered a different verdict. Perhaps the most haunting element of the revelation was its silence. No record exists of James himself ever knowing the truth. He died a respected patriarch, apparently unaware of the extraordinary circumstances of his birth. His descendants inherited not just his estate, but the story Eleanor had written, a story that defined their identity for generations. To discover, decades later, that this identity was built upon a deliberate falsehood was more than a genealogical shock. It was an existential reckoning. And so, by the time the court filings were sealed and the newspaper articles forgotten, the damage was done. The Lavington name remained on the city's schools and libraries, but its meaning had changed irrevocably. No longer a symbol of unbroken lineage, it became a testament to fragility of historical truth, to how easily it can be bent, obscured, and rewritten, and how stubbornly, despite every effort to erase it, the past insists on revealing itself. The revelation of James Lavington's true parentage sent quiet shockwaves through Savannah society, but its most enduring consequences unfolded not in the headlines or the courts, but in the subtle ways history itself was reshaped to contain the scandal. Families of old standing had long understood how to bury inconvenient truths, and the Lavingtons, even in their fractured state, proved no exception. In the decades following the 1937 inheritance dispute, a deliberate campaign of silence and selective memory began to take hold. It did not erase the past entirely, Such a thing was impossible by then, but it blurred its edges, softened its sharper truths, and folded its most uncomfortable revelations into narratives that could be lived with. One of the first acts of this quiet erasure came from within the family itself. Portraits of James that once hung prominently in the courthouse rotunda and the Savannah Historical Society's gallery were quietly removed under the pretext of restoration. They were never rehung. The Lavington endowments, scholarships, libraries, and church renovations that bore the family name continued, but plaques that once included James's birth date were replaced with generic inscriptions that omitted any reference to lineage. Family genealogies, revised for new editions in the 1940s and 1950s, subtly altered timelines, pushing Thomas's death date forward by a year or describing James as adopted without elaboration. The intention was clear: to muddy the waters just enough that casual readers would not question the official story. Savannah's civic institutions followed suit. Public records referencing the 1937 court case were sealed to protect family privacy, a practice that would have been unthinkable for less prominent citizens. The Evening Ledger quietly pulled its follow-up article on the bloodline revelations after pressure from influential Lavington allies on the city council. Even the Georgia Historical Society, which held Sarah's letters and Eleanor's unsigned confession, restricted access to those documents for decades, citing their sensitive nature. Scholars requesting them were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, and some were denied outright. In this way, the mechanisms of archival control, who gets to see, who gets to write, who gets to publish, became tools for shaping the official memory of the Lavington affair. Yet for all these efforts, silence could not fully contain the story. In Savannah's Black community, where oral history had always been a vessel for truths the written record refused to hold, the tale of Sarah and her son continued to circulate. Storytellers spoke of a woman who walked into the big house and never walked out, of a boy who inherited the land that was watered with his mother's tears. These stories were not uniform. Each telling varied in its details, but their core remained the same, that the Lavington legacy rested on the sacrifice of a woman whose name was deliberately erased. For the descendants of Sarah's kin, this was not merely a piece of historical trivia. It was a wound, reopened each time the Lavington name was praised in civic ceremonies or etched onto new public buildings. Academic interest in the case revived in the 1960s and 1970s as social historians and genealogists began re-examining Southern family histories through the lens of race and power. Freed from the social taboos that had silenced earlier researchers, scholars started connecting the scattered evidence into a coherent narrative. They traced the movement of enslaved women like Sarah through state records, reconstructed the timeline of James's early life, and brought forensic scrutiny to the baptismal irregularities and sealed room evidence. A new generation of historians argued that the Lavington case was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader, largely undocumented pattern of racial passing engineered by white women in positions of power. Eleanor's deception, they argued, was not only an act of personal desperation, but radical, if deeply flawed, form of resistance against a system that sought to dictate the fates of women and the enslaved alike. This interpretation sparked fierce debate. Some hailed Eleanor as a tragic figure, a woman who used the tools available to her in a patriarchal, racist society to give a child born into bondage a future he would otherwise have been denied. They pointed out that by presenting James as Thomas's son, she secured his legal freedom, inheritance, and social standing in a world that would have condemned him to slavery or marginalization. Others rejected this framing as revisionist and dangerous, arguing that Eleanor's act, however well-intentioned, also erased Sarah from history and perpetuated the very structures of power she appeared to subvert. By passing Sarah's child as her own, Eleanor ensured his survival, but she also ensured that his true identity and his mother's sacrifice would be forgotten by those who controlled the written record. The Lavington descendants themselves were deeply divided. A few embraced the truth, commissioning private research and even meeting with members of Sarah's extended family to piece together the fuller story. Others retreated into denial, insisting that the evidence was inconclusive and accusing historians of sensationalism. Some sold off portions of the family estate, preferring liquidation to the burden of a tainted legacy. Still others doubled down on philanthropic endeavors, endowing scholarships for African American students, gestures many interpreted as attempts at quiet atonement. But through all these responses, one thread remained constant. None of them could undo what had been revealed. The Lavington name, once a symbol of lineage and authority, was now inseparable from the story of the woman it had sought to erase. Even today, the Lavington case occupies an uneasy place in Savannah's historical memory. The family mansion is now a museum, its grand halls and manicured gardens drawing tourists eager for a glimpse of antebellum grandeur. Yet the museum's official tours tread lightly over the story of James's birth, mentioning it only in passing, if at all. A small placard near the east wing acknowledges that some historians have questioned aspects of the Lavington family narrative, but the fuller truth remains absent from the curated experience. It is as if the past itself is still negotiating how much of its own reflection it is willing to confront. This silence, institutional, familial, societal, is itself a form of testimony. It reveals how deeply unsettling the truth remains, even more than a century and a half later. The Lavington case is not merely a story about one woman's deception. It is a story about how societies respond when their myths are threatened, about how far they will go to protect narratives that give shape to their identity. It is a story about how easily a name can be separated from the flesh and blood that gave it life, and how stubbornly that flesh and blood refuse to disappear, no matter how many ledgers are altered or portraits removed. In the end, the attempt to erase Sarah and her son from the historical record failed. Not entirely, but enough to matter. Her letters survived. Oral traditions endured. Scientific evidence pierced the veil of secrecy. And together, they ensured that the story Eleanor tried to bury would continue to rise, generation after generation, demanding to be heard. The silence surrounding the Lavington name did not conceal the truth. It became the soil in which that truth took root. History, for all its claims to truth, is never more than a partial record of what happened. It is shaped as much by what is preserved as by what is destroyed, by what is spoken aloud as by what is silenced. The story of Eleanor Lavington, Sarah, and the boy who will become James Lavington stands as one of the clearest examples of this tension. More than a century and a half later, we know more about their lives than anyone in their own time dared speak. And yet, crucial pieces remain missing, perhaps forever. What we are left with is not a tidy conclusion, but a haunting mosaic of fact, silence, and speculation, each piece forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world that created this story and the one that inherited it. One of those truths is the extraordinary power of social fiction, the ability of a single lie, repeated and institutionalized, to reshape lives, fortunes, and legacies for generations. Eleanor Lavington did not merely deceive her neighbors or the church. She deceived history itself. By entering James's name into the baptismal record, by presenting him as Thomas's heir, by sealing shutters and dismissing servants and rewriting documents, she changed the trajectory of not only one life but an entire lineage. That fiction persisted through decades of public life, charitable works, and civic honors. It endured because people wanted it to endure, because to question it would have meant questioning the racial, social, and legal structures upon which their world depended. Yet the Lavington story is also about the fragility of that fiction. It shows how even most carefully constructed lies could be undone by the smallest fragments: a letter hidden in a desk, a line in a baptismal register, a memory whispered in a kitchen. It shows how the past resists erasure, how truth seeps through cracks no matter how many layers of paint are applied. Eleanor's plan succeeded beyond what she could have imagined. James lived and died a free man of wealth and standing. But the cost of that success was silence. The erasure of Sarah's name, the burial of her sacrifice, the denial of a heritage James himself never knew. And even that silence could not hold forever. The story also forces us to grapple with uncomfortable moral questions that resist simple answers. Was Eleanor's act monstrous, a theft of identity and motherhood committed to preserve her own privilege? Or was it, in its own deeply flawed way, an act of mercy, a desperate attempt to save a child from a life of bondage by smuggling him into a different world? Perhaps it was both. Eleanor exploited a system she also defied. She preserved the racial order even as she subverted it. She erased Sarah from the record even as she fulfilled her wish for her son's freedom. It is precisely this moral ambiguity that makes the Lavington case so haunting. It refuses the comfort of a clear villain or hero. instead revealing how deeply complicity and resistance can intertwine. For Sarah, the historical record offers even fewer certainties. We do not know what became of her after the spring of 1854. We do not know whether she was sent away, sold, or buried in secret on the edge of the Lavington property. We do not know if she ever saw her son again, or if she lived long enough to witness the life he built. Her existence survives in fragments, a name in a ledger, a few letters written in a trembling hand, the echoes of stories passed from one generation to the next. And yet, for all that the record withholds, her presence is unmistakable. It lingers in the features of James's descendants, in the contradictions of the estate's ledgers, in the very scandal that shattered the Lavington myth. Erased though she was, Sarah remains a ghost at the heart of this story, the truth that no amount of silence could bury. The legacy of the Lavington affair continues to shape Savannah today, even if few residents know the details. The mansion, now a museum, stands as a monument not just to antebellum wealth, but to the lives that sustained it. The scholarships and libraries endowed by James still serve the city, their plaques bearing a name that once concealed another. And in archives and family attics across Georgia, researchers continue to uncover new fragments. A bill of sale that might place Sarah on a nearby plantation, a letter hinting at clandestine payments made to ensure silence, a faded photograph of a child whose features complicate the story even further. Each discovery deepens our understanding, but each also reminds us how much remains unknown. What the records don't say, and perhaps never will, is how James himself would have felt if he had known the truth. Would he have rejected the life built on a lie, or embraced it as the price of his freedom? Would he have sought out the woman whose name was erased so that it could endure? These questions hang over the story like unanswered prayers, unresolvable yet essential. They remind us that history is not only about what happened, but about the human lives that unfolded within and around those events. Lives filled with love, fear, compromise, and hope. In the end, the Lavington story is less about a single deception than about the broader truths it reveals. It is about how societies construct and defend myths of purity and lineage, and how those myths can be upended by the quiet defiance of those they seek to exclude. It is about the endurance of truth in the face of erasure, and it is about the uneasy space between justice and injustice, love and exploitation, concealment and revelation. Above all, it is about the power of the past to unsettle the present, to remind us that beneath every polished family name, beneath every grand house and venerable institution, there may lie a story built not on blood and honor, but on silence, sacrifice, and a lie too dangerous to speak. And so, we return to the question that began this investigation. How many names carved into courthouse walls, how many fortunes passed from father to son, rest on secrets as profound as the one Eleanor Lavington carried to her grave? How many stories like Sarah's remain buried, their truths scattered in forgotten drawers and unmarked graves? History will not answer those questions easily, but as the Lavington case shows, it has a way of answering them eventually, no matter how long the silence lasts.